Hi everyone, welcome back to the Property Finance Podcast, and today I want to talk about refinancing rescues. So this is talking about 5 key points, like we did in the previous episode when we were talking about budgets blowing up. This is 5 key points as to what you need to have in the back of your mind when it comes to kind of refinancing mid-project. So first key point is identifying when refinancing is actually the right move. So there are probably 2 key scenarios where refinancing is the right thing to do mid-project. So the first one is raising equity to invest into another project, or for a cost overrun. But let's think positively. Let's say it's raising equity for another project. So you might be 75% of the way through a build on a project, and by doing a finish and exit product on that, which takes you up to 75% loan to GDV as opposed to 65 on your standard dev finance, releasing that 10% extra against GDV might be the equity that you need to go and put into another project. Now, as you get into, and again, this is kind of difficult because we talk about raising finance and doing development loans and everything else. I don't tend to talk about strategy too much. But one of the strategies that I've seen that's worked really, really well, and it's a good developer friend of mine that's done it, is essentially they'll have 3 projects on the go at any one time. So they'll have one in planning, one in build, one in sales. That is their sort of strategy that they work on. So that at any one point, they're working on a build, they're working on selling some units, and they're working on getting their next site ready. And that's their kind of 3-site rotation that they do. Now, when they're working on this one that's in the build phase, it may be that when they're 75% of the way through the build, they need to release equity in order to pay for some planning applications over here or to pay for land or something in stage 1. So for them, it's a case of refinancing here at stage 2 to raise money for stage 1. You may also look at refinancing during the sales period as well. So you might have a project in stage 3, which is in the sales, and you might say, well, I want to do a dev exit on that. And I might want to then raise some money to then put into either a cost overrun here or again into planning. So as you can see, stage 2 and stage 3 have got their own refinancing options. And this is working on the basis of build to sell. If you're doing build to rent, it's not as relevant because obviously when you get to the point of finishing the build, you refinance onto a mortgage anyway. So dev exit isn't really a product on that one. But again, even on build to rent, you could refinance partway through the build if you wanted to sort of inject another project into stage 1. So that's kind of the first way that refinancing mid-project is a good thing to do. The second one is to save money. Now, it sounds kind of backwards saying, well, refinancing to save money, how does that work? Well, it's no different to a buy-to-let or a resi mortgage. As interest rates come down, you look for the cheaper option. If you're a first-time developer, you've never done a development before, you're getting into your first project, your development finance is going to be circa 12-13% per annum, realistically. If you then throw in creative financing strategies like deferred payments, bridging below market value, if you're doing vendor finance, if you're putting none of your own money in and using investor money, again, you're probably going to push those rates up to 13-14%. You then start to throw in mezzanine finance, you could be talking about getting up to a blended rate of 16-17-18%. So what I mean by sort of refinance to save money is what we have a lot of developers who will raise development finance at that 12-13-14% mark because they've got the creative strategies. They will get the build up to wind and watertight, and they will then refinance onto a finish and exit product to finish the remainder of the build. But this product will be at maybe circa 8-9% per annum. So quite a hefty annual saving. And they'll do that as early as possible so that they basically reduce the amount of time that they're on the expensive development finance and increase the time that they're on the cheaper. That strategy only really works if you are refinancing quicker than probably halfway through your development finance term. So if you've got an 18-month term, you need to be refinancing around month 8, 9, 10. That's kind of the sweet spot. Any later than that, realistically, it's not going to be saving you a huge amount of money, not unless you're on super expensive development finance and you're going on to super cheap finish and exit. When it comes to talking about dev exit, again, you're talking about going from rates of 12, 13, 14 down to probably rates of 7.5, 8.5. And again, it depends on that sales period. I would only really do dev exit. I wouldn't do it to save money. I would do dev exit personally to allow more time if you're running out of time. I would do it to raise equity to put into another project. I wouldn't just solely do it to save on the interest rate because I don't think you'd make the saving with all the fees and everything else. So I would only purely do it for an extension of time and raising equity. The cheaper interest rate is just a bonus on top of that. So they're kind of the two main scenarios where refinancing mid-projects makes sense. The second key point I want to talk about is kind of the steps of approaching the lender for a sort of mid-refinancing. So this is talking about approaching a new lender. Your existing lender, not so much, because they don't care if they're getting paid back. They're kind of not really bothered. So this is talking about approaching a new lender. So the things that you need to have prepared, you need to have your warranties, you need to have all your sign-offs up to date. You'll need to have everything in place in that regard. Approach your broker, run through all of the numbers, say, right, okay, I've spent this much so far with the development lender. I want to move on to new finish and exit finance. This is what I need to finish the build. This is what I've already got. And then it's a case of working out the numbers and whether it makes sense. Where you would approach your current lender is where they potentially offer a finish and exit product themselves, for example. So what you might say is you might have an existing lender. You might see that a cost overrun is coming and you might say to them, well, look, we've got it up to window watertight. Could you flip us onto that product instead? See whether they're open to it or not. The other thing as well is, as we mentioned in the previous episode, is talking to them about potentially increasing the facility versus maybe a new GDV if the GDV's gone up. They're sort of some discussions that you can have with the lender part way. So that's where that communication would come in. Then the third key point I want to talk about is kind of the documentation. We briefly mentioned it just a second ago. So you need to have all of your warranties in place in terms of you need to have instructed someone like NHBC, ICW. You need to get them in place and they need to be doing their site visits and sign-offs as you're going through. Obviously, you're going to have all your building regs sign-off. You're going to have all of those relevant sign-offs that you need. So, for example, getting your foundation signed off. As you can see, I don't do the sign-offs on site, so I'm not quite sure all the other bits that you need signing off. But anyway, you need to have all of these sign-offs up to date. That's the first set of documents that you're going to need. The second bit is getting what you spent to date laid out. So that could be by getting an up-to-date QS report, for example. So the QS for the current lender might provide a report that says, right, you've had this much, you've got this much left, this is what we've signed off on, XYZ. That can always be quite helpful. The other thing with finish and exit as well is that you could potentially, where you've got a QS for lender 1, so your existing lender, and you want to move to lender 2, that QS may be able to move over to lender 2. So that's quite helpful. We've got that at the moment with a QS firm called Evolve. They started working with one lender and they've moved over to the second lender, basically to carry on and have some continuity. The fourth key point is, and I've got some notes here that I'm just reading off, but the fourth key point is the potential pitfalls of refinancing mid-project. So the risk you've got, and there's only one really big risk, is obviously you're with lender A, you're comfy, all the loan to GDVs are sorted, your GDVs are already set by the value of everything else. Moving to lender 2, you have to have a new set of valuations, a new set of QS reports. The risk you have is when you move over to the second lender, your GDV could drop on that valuation. Your build cost could go up on the QS report. So by having the same value of the same QS moving over, that's how you can avoid that pitfall. If you've got to have a new value or a new QS, that's the biggest pitfall I would see in terms of sort of mid-development refinancing. There aren't really many other pitfalls because you're doing it for an extension of time. You're doing it for raising equity. You're not doing it necessarily out of desperation. If you're doing it out of desperation, obviously, that again could create pitfalls if you haven't got your warranties in place, if you haven't got your sign-offs in place. Obviously, that is going to cause problems. The last key point I want to talk about is kind of almost a bit of a case study. So I've got two. I'll talk about the first one first. So that's sort of talking about dev exit. So this is where it's effective for what we mentioned earlier, not dropping the interest rate, but raising equity and increasing time. So we had a developer who was building 8 bungalows in Lincolnshire. In fact, actually, I think the site in total was 13 bungalows, but 5 had already sold. 8 were sticking on the market. They backed onto the golf course, gorgeous bungalows, but 8 were sticking on the market. What happened was they had 1.6 million outstanding with their development finance lender. I think it was probably more accurately 1.65. So 1.65 outstanding with their current development lender. What happened is they came to us and said, look, we're running out of time. The development lender's talking about sort of closing everything down. Sales haven't been happening. We're getting a bit squeaky. We think the sales will come, but we need another 12 months. Okay, fine. Let's have a look. Right. So we spoke to a development exit lender. They essentially gave a net facility of 2.25 million. So they said, yeah, we'll give you 2.25 million net after fees, interest, everything else. What that did for the development company is it gave them an extra 12 months to sell those bungalows. It got them out of a hole with the current development finance lender, because the problem is if they go into default with that development lender, if they go into repossession, insolvency, everything else, it completely wipes out the ability to do any other deals, because you're screwed then, basically. So by being able to pay back the existing development finance lender, they kept that relationship. So that's a positive relationship. They've been paid back on time. They've developed a new relationship with a new lender. That lender's come in. They've paid off that lender. They're then left with approximately £600,000 above that. So they've got £600,000 worth of equity. That equity then went into 2 other development sites. Those 2 development sites were probably GDVs of millions. I think one was 3.5. I think one was 5.5, 6 million. So big projects. I mean, talking nearly £10 million of GDV. So had they not done the development exit, they would have missed out on these other 2 projects over here. That would have then had a massive financial implication for them moving forward. So by being able to invest in these other 2 projects, they've essentially secured the viability of their company for the next 3 or 4 years. So where we said earlier about those sort of 3 stages of deals, this is a different developer, this case study, but essentially what that allows them to do is, again, they've stage 3, they've got something in sales, they've released equity, they've then put that equity into stage 1. That's then bought them 2 more sites. Those 2 sites will then move into build, and the cycle continues. And that's essentially what that dev exit has allowed them to do. In the second scenario, so this was a finish and exit. We had a development of 5 units. And essentially the reason why we went for finish and exit, they'd got to win them watertight, but they had, again, another site that came up. So they had another site for, I think it was a barn conversion and 3 new builds. And essentially by doing that finish and exit, we managed to raise 10% of the GDV, which was about 400 grand, I think, was what we managed to raise. So we raised 400 grand out of that. That then bought that site in its entirety. So they were able to make a cash purchase of that site. Then they could raise finance against that and do whatever they wanted. But by being able to raise, again, looking at this 3-phase sort of strategy, they've got a build in stage 2. They've identified a site that can go into stage 1. So they've raised equity out of stage 2 to put into stage 1. They've then secured a new site with a GDV of 2.25 million by putting in 400 grand. So for them, they've got an unencumbered site over here. Yes, okay, they've increased the debt on stage 2 by 400 grand. But again, you need to look at each of these individually, project by project, and work out whether refinancing is the right thing. But they've increased the finance here by 400 grand. However, when stage 1 comes to refinance into development finance, that could again raise equity, which could go back into that project that they raised the money out of to begin with, which then levels everything out. So it's just a nice way of being able to, at each of these stages, refinance to put stuff back into the beginning. So stage 2, you're talking about your finish and exit stuff. Stage 3, you're talking about development exit. So hopefully that's been really helpful for giving you, if nothing else, just that sort of visual of the 3-stage strategy, which is kind of your planning, acquisition, your build, and then your sales. And I think that hopefully will, as a developer, if you're listening to this, will hopefully give you a bit of an idea of, right, okay, I need to focus on acquiring stuff for stage 1. I need to focus on when I'm in my build. If I need to refinance, I can put more stuff into stage 1. If I'm in the sales, I can refinance to put money into stage 2 or stage 1. And it just gives you an idea of that ecosystem, if you like, of how you can sort of get more stuff coming into that pipeline. So hopefully it's helpful. If it was, please like, share, subscribe, all of that usual stuff. It really does help the podcast get out there. But otherwise, thank you very much for your support, and I'll catch you on the next one.